So hi friends, and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and welcome to my end of January reading roundup. Hi friends, and welcome back. And if you've been watching the channel, you'll know that I've been doing a Read What You Own challenge. I have a TBR of 243 books as of the 1st of January, and I just determined to get that down to something more manageable because it's giving me storage issues if nothing else. So I thought I'll do a Read What You Own challenge, read 100 books off my TBR whilst also having a book buying ban, so I didn't add to it. The caveat to the ban being that I could buy something if it was something I've been after a long time and suddenly found, or it was suddenly reduced in price to something reasonable. So, how did I get on in January? Well, the first thing is that if you've watched my January mid-month reading roundup video, which was on a bit late, I'm afraid, but I got there with it, you'll know that by the 15th of the month, I had read 5 of the books on my 10-book monthly TBR. So I was halfway and on target. And I'm going to just quickly run through what those were, but you can obviously, if you want more information about them, you can go back and watch that previous video. I'll link to it in the description below. I might put a card to it somewhere on the screen if I can figure out how to do that. But just for now, let's just quickly run through what those 5 titles were. So the first of those was The Broken Window by Jeffrey Deaver, which is the 8th in his Lincoln Rhyme series, and in this one the detective and his colleague Amelia Sachs take on an identity thief who not only uses his skills to target his victims but also to frame innocent people for them. And that's a cracking thriller, really recommend that one. Second, I read Marianne Dreams, which is a 1950s children's novel by Catherine Starr. It's a fantasy. I wasn't so keen on that one, I must admit. Then I read John Burke's Hammer Horror Film Omnibus. This is actually volume 1 of 2, and there are 4 short novels in here which are taken from the screenplays of Hammer Horror movies. Just quickly for your information, those movies were The Gorgon, The Curse of Frankenstein, The Revenge of Frankenstein, and The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. Although I had already read The Curse of Frankenstein and reviewed that separately on the channel. But I read those, and they're fine, they're okay. Then I read an example of Lost World Literature, A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James DeMille. This is very strange. It's a satire basically on Victorian society. I wasn't all that taken with it, but I've read worse. And finally, in the first half of the month, I read The Face in the Glass, which was the next in the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. The 7th one, I believe, that they published. And this is a book of short stories, Gothic Tales by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This was a very consistent work, even if, for me, the supernatural forces in it were all a little bit too English and polite. But there you are, it was still fun. So, moving on, what else did I read in January? That's the big question. And I'm going to have to take a little quick break here and have a quick edit so I can actually clear the table and get these books in order. So, having rushed through those a little bit there, what did I read in the second half of the month? Well, the first of those was Set the Night on Fire, Living, Dying and Playing Guitar with the Doors by Robby Krieger. Now, the Doors are one of my favourite 60s psychedelic rock bands, and if you all recall, my top 10 books of last year did include No One Here Gets Out Alive, the biography of singer Jim Morrison by Danny Sugarman and Jerry Hopkins. But I was interested to read from the perspective of someone who was actually in the band, because all the other 3 members, aside from Morrison, did in fact subsequently write a book about it in later years, and this is Krieger's entry. And I found this to be extremely enjoyable. Krieger is a very down-to-earth, grounded sort of guy, at least that's the way he comes across in the book, and I think what we've got here is a very straightforward telling of the tale. What he does is he alternates chapters between a tale about the Doors and a tale about his subsequent life after the band had finished, and that, to me, that non-chronological approach, that non-chronological approach actually works really well here. And I thought it still seemed like a cohesive book. He still managed to pull everything together, and I found this to be smart, very witty, and extremely enjoyable. And Krieger doesn't shy away from telling some less than flattering tales about himself, and also in subsequent years about his drug problems, which started well after the band was finished. And he frames them in such a way that there's a lot of black humour involved, so it's not too preachy, although he makes it clear what a very stupid idea the whole drug thing was. He does mention No One Here Gets Out Alive, and he's obviously not a fan of that book. But he's actually more critical of the book written by keyboard player Ray Manzarek, which is interesting because he played with Manzarek in various bands over the years after the Doors were over. But he feels that Manzarek did do what I've seen as accused of toward No One Here Gets Out Alive, basically mythologizing Morrison as some kind of spaceman, mystic, shaman type character. Something that, if you've seen the movie The Doors by Oliver Stone, you'll kind of understand what I mean by that. But all in all, this was a fantastic autobiography and a great read, and I definitely recommend it, particularly if you're a Doors fan, obviously, but even if you're just into rock biographies and if you're just interested in the 1960s music scene. It's excellent stuff. So moving on from there, after that, let's go to some... Oh, this is nearly all non-fiction, by the way, but we'll go to some fiction next. And this is The Mind of Mr. Soames by Charles Eric Maine. And again, if you're a fan of the channel, you'll know I've been doing a series of videos on books that were turned into movies by the British studio Amicus in the late 60s and early 1970s, and they did that with The Mind of Mr. Soames, with a considerably larger budget, I guess, than the other movies I've covered, mainly because the star was Terence Stamp, and he was a very big name at the time. Now, this is the story of John Soames, a man who was born into a coma and has spent the entirety of his 30 years on the planet basically unconscious, until a Japanese surgeon comes along with a revolutionary new technique of brain surgery and wakes him up. But obviously he's a child mentally, but in a man's body, and the doctors attending him try to work out how to educate him and turn him into a responsible adult so he can integrate into society. Now, this was a pretty disappointing read for me. I'd have seen the movie, but it was many years ago, so I don't recall anything about it. So I didn't really know a great deal what to expect from this. But I found the first half especially dragged awfully and was very academic almost, as the doctors discuss various ways to educate Soames and put together a program to bring him into the adult world. And it might have been interesting to a child psychologist, but to a layman like me, it was not very exciting at all. Just beyond the halfway point, Soames escapes from the institution and goes on the run, and all those serious academic questions are largely jettisoned in favour of an underwhelming manhunt drama. Now, I'll be doing a full video on this at some point when I've seen the movie again, so I can compare and contrast, but I found the book to be pretty disappointing. The message that innocence is always crushed by big bad society is hardly very original, and I didn't think it was told here in a very compelling way. So moving on to the next book in our monthly roundup, let's go back to some non-fiction here. Yeah, let's do this one. And this is, let's get hold of it here, Blood and Black Lace, the definitive guide to Italian sex and horror movies by Adrian Luther Smith. And this is actually a guide to what we call today Giallo movies. But the Giallo wasn't a very recognised term back in 1999 when this was originally published, as what I believe was the first actual literary work on this subgenre of movie. Now, I don't think Giallo is a well-known term outside the cult movie world, so if you're not aware of what a Giallo is, generally speaking, it's a whodunit murder mystery where there's a series of killings being carried out by an unknown assailant whose secret identity is revealed at the end. There's plenty of beautiful women who don't seem to have much of a wardrobe budget, and the kills are generally pretty horrific, and it's seen pretty commonly now as one of the main precursors of the American slasher craze of the 1970s and 80s, which gave us Halloween, Friday the 13th and everything else. Now, these films were primarily made in Italy in the early 1970s, where they literally turned out hundreds of them. They were so popular. And this is, as I say, I think the first guide that was published to them, and is very comprehensive, featuring some very obscure titles, as well as the famous ones which were directed by the likes of Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci. And this book is quite a handsome volume as well, with many movie stills and film posters, which were known, I think, as Locandina. Anyway, here to show you briefly, let's hope we don't get too much light shining on it. Here's an example of what you get with the book. It's very handsome indeed, as I say, quite a smart and glossy volume. Now, I do think it's a very good and solid guide. But what I would do is dispute a couple of the selections that the author makes to include here, particularly Don't Look Now with Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, which I know takes place in Venice, but it never occurred to me to think of it as a giallo before. Similarly, Antonioni's Blow Up from 1966. I would never have included that myself either. But then, let's face it, trying to pigeonhole movies into certain genres and subgenres and all that, it's a pretty pointless task and seems just an excuse for a lot of people to argue about what to include and what not to include. So, in short, I think this is a great volume, and I certainly recommend it if you're into the giallo and you want to know more about it. So, moving on from there, and this one is the autobiography of actor Errol Flynn, My Wicked Wicked Ways, which was published, I believe, in 1959, just a couple of months before he collapsed with a fatal heart attack. And if you don't know, Flynn was probably just as famous for his lifestyle of debauchery, drinking and women as he was for his acting career. So the first question you tend to ask when you're looking at an autobiography, how honest is it? And I would say with Flynn's book, very honest. Simply because he admits some things in the book that he did not have to talk about, and they're pretty bad. Firstly, he does admit that once a young man, when he lived in New Guinea, he was involved with nothing less than the slave trade. He talks about a trip he took into the interior of the country where he purchased a number of native tribesmen from their chief and took them across country to work in a mine. Now, he does say that he was very careful to treat his boys, as he calls them, very well, but it's still slavery, whichever way you look at it. He also talks about one instance slightly later in his life when he was living off older women, shall we say. That's a good euphemism. And he actually fled the country at one point after stealing a woman's diamonds, which he kept with him for many years until, ironically, they were stolen from him when he was drunk. He also talks about maintaining a ranch in Hollywood when he was a star, specifically for the purpose of holding cockfights, which might not have been quite such a red flag in 1959 when the book was published as it is today, but it was still illegal. Now, none of those things Flynn has to mention. Certainly the first two items there would be no other witnesses who could come forward back then when the world wasn't so connected in order to expose what he'd done. So, yeah, I think it's a very honest book, certainly in that respect. So if you're looking for some fun and amusing Hollywood anecdotes, yep, there's plenty of those here too. And Flynn's not above poking fun at himself, but you do get the impression that this was a very unhappy and contradictory man. And he even quotes some of his contradictions towards the end of the book, and I'll give you a few. I will do a great deal for a buck, but when I get it, I will throw it away. I laugh a lot, but I weep secretly much more than most men. And perhaps most tellingly, I have a zest for living, yet twice an urge to die, which is a very strange thing to say. Now, also, he talks a great deal in the book about wanting to be a writer. But when it comes down to the one screenplay that he did write for a movie, The Adventures of Captain Fabian, which came out in 1951, he doesn't talk about that at all. Just lists that film as one of several that he made at that particular point in his career. A strange omission, because you think even if the final result was disappointing to him, you still think he'd talk about it. Now, my overriding impression of Flynn reading this book was of a man who was never at peace with himself. I didn't dislike him, despite some of the rather horrible things that he did, but I didn't feel sorry for him either. In the end, I just couldn't warm to him. He seemed like a man who was very self-involved and never really had a great deal of empathy for others. I'd say the book is certainly an interesting read, but I wouldn't say it was an essential one. And I doubt if I'll be hanging on to my copy. So, after that, I'm afraid we're going to do some more movies. And I think, how many books have we done? So I think this must be, yes, we're there. We are there, aren't we? Because this is book number 10. So did I do 10 books off my TBR? Yes, I did. But not off my monthly TBR. Because if you watch that video, you'll know that the last one left on that list that I haven't talked about is Twice Told Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I didn't get through that, I'm afraid. I didn't read it. So I read something else instead. And that book was another movie guide, one that I got for Christmas. And this is Tome of Terror, horror films of the 1930s by Christopher Workman and Troy Howarth. And this is actually a follow-up to the original Tome of Terror book, which was covered the silent horror movie era. This one is absolutely terrific. It's incredibly comprehensive. I came to this being a huge fan of classic horror from that era, thinking there weren't going to be many films in here that I'd never seen because I've seen all the major ones. Well, I was wrong. There are quite a lot of films in here I haven't seen. Sure, they're mostly borderline horror, and by that I'm talking about old dark house mysteries and westerns with supernatural elements, which I didn't think was such a big thing, but apparently it was in B-movie land back in 1930s Hollywood. But yeah, so there's lots of things in there that I hadn't heard of and that I was really interested to read about and that I'll be trying to track down. I think a lot of them are on YouTube, so yeah, I'll be watching most of those. Now, this was, as I say, the follow-up to one about silent movies, which I thought was even better, if that's possible. I think both volumes are great. The only real disappointment for me is that this volume is now quite old and there's no sign of a volume about the 1940s. And I think that's an enormous shame. I'd love to get a volume 3, if you like. So I don't know what's happened there, but I mean, these things do take years to research, I'm sure, so I don't suppose it's definitely off the table. It might still appear, but I think it's been about 10 years since that one came out, so maybe looking a bit doubtful now. But anyway, the point was, I did my 10 books, didn't I? That was what was great. What an achievement. I've got my... Oh, hang on, though. I did another one. Yes, I actually did 11 because I got this done as well. The Great Stone of Sardis by Frank R. Stockton, which is a Lost World, Hollow Earth novel, kind of. And why I say that and sound a bit doubtful, it's nothing to do with the Hollow Earth element or the Lost World element. Well, not a great deal to do with those. More to do with the novel element. Because although this is presented as a novel, it reads very much like two novellas slapped together. And I don't mean just like one followed by another. I mean literally smashed together, so you've got two stories going on at the same time. So let me explain by giving you a quick summary of the story. Now, Roland Clue is an inventor and a genius, and perhaps the greatest genius that the world has ever known. Not only has he created a brand new submersible called the Dipsy, which he sends to the Arctic regions to discover the North Pole, he's also invented something called the Artesian Ray, which can peer into the bowels of the Earth and see what's there. At the same time, he's also come up with something called, I think, the automatic shell, which is like a burrowing machine. And the harder the substance it meets on its journeys, the more power it gains, without any external source, which seems to suggest he's invented perpetual motion as well. I told you this guy is basically Einstein and Da Vinci rolled into one. Anyway, the shell falls off its scaffolding, which presumably Roland hadn't invented, and starts burrowing into the earth, and it creates this shaft 14.5 miles deep before it comes to a sudden and mysterious halt. And of course Roland comes up with a quick form of transportation so he can pop down the shaft and have a look at what's at the bottom. So the reader gets two narratives for the price of one, running side by side. They're only really connected at the start, which sets up the situations, and at the end through a fairly clumsy plot device of a traitor in Roland's camp. And this has the effect of neither feeling that it's expanded into a full novel. Both of them feel pretty slight. One interesting aspect is that Stockton wrote this in 1898, during the technological upheaval at the turn of the 20th century. But the book is set in 1947, and his unusual contention is that after this technological upheaval, humanity has chosen to reject some of this progress and go backwards instead for a couple of decades. And this is an unusual idea, and one that might seem incredibly unlikely unless you live in the UK, because over here, let's face it, nothing's as good as it used to be, and the good old days were much better than these, weren't they? Sorry, but nostalgia over here is like a national disease. So in the end, I can't really recommend this book particularly. It's certainly better than some of the Lost World literature I've reviewed on this channel, and I may do a full review on it, and I may not. It was a little underwhelming, I'm afraid. So that's it for today. Thank you for staying with me through this video. Please don't forget to... Oh, hang on. That's not it though, is it? Because I haven't done the totalizing yet, or whatever it's called. Because we need to go through how many my TBR was standing at the start of the year, how I'm doing on this Read What You Own challenge, how many books I bought this month, and how many are now on my TBR. So let's have a drum roll, please, and let's get those figures on the screen. So let's go through the spiel again. Thank you for staying with me this video right the way until the end. It's much appreciated. And please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that notification bell if for some obscure reason you're enjoying my content. Also, please don't forget to keep searching through those second-hand bookshops, those charity shelves and those market stalls, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Thank you, and see you in the next one.